Another resource that we've embedded into the students' website is the virtual office. Now, this is a resource that's been produced by Comcare, which is an Australian government website. So it's available for anyone to look at. So it's a terrific website because the students can click on, for example, an office environment, and they can look at different aspects of that environment. So they can click on the furniture, and it comes up with the different types of furniture in the office. So for example, the chair, and then it looks at the hazards that might present. So a chair that's not the appropriate size for the person, or a chair where the edge of the seat isn't sufficiently rounded or padded, and the sorts of interventions or controls that the occupational therapist could recommend. So maybe they need to do a further ergonomic assessment, maybe they need to look at trialing different types of chairs with their client. So this really looks at the learning objectives those learning objectives that ask the OT to look at how you would assess a client and how you would determine what their needs are in terms of intervention and how you evaluate those. So this is another really good learning resource we've embedded into the student's website. Now, just to continue on, they were the first four intended learning outcomes. The next one was looking at justifying the role of occupational therapy for enabling productive occupation within traditional and non-traditional emerging areas of practice. Now, this is I guess this particular learning outcome is particularly related to Module 2, where we ask students to explore productivity as it changes perhaps in someone's life. So perhaps people who are moving into retirement, but it could also mean what is it productivity for people who don't engage in paid employment, and that may mean people who have a significant disability or illness. So this is an emerging area of practice for OT, and perhaps a non-traditional area, but certainly one that's important given that we're an ageing population, so there's more people moving from paid employment into retirement, and also we're a population where we want where there's a lot of evidence that's emerging about the importance of people engaging in meaningful occupations, productive occupations, and the impact that has on their health and well-being. The last learning outcome is for students to develop skills in communication and collaboration, both orally and in written form. And this is an outcome that we embed into our courses right from year one, and we expect students will build on that competency throughout their years of undergraduate education. So by third year and second semester, we really want them to be consolidating their skills. This learning outcome I'm going to talk about a bit more under graduate attributes. So the next element that I wanted to examine was looking at how I have aligned the intended learning outcomes of the program with those of the course itself. So for example, I'll just use an example here. Element number 2 is looking at applying research evidence and critical and collaborative reasoning in occupational therapy practice. Now, I think that the second and the fifth learning outcome really reflect that program learning outcomes. So we want students to be able to, in their analysis of research and a critical review of what the evidence suggests, we want them to be able to analyse relationships between the work environment and the person and their productive occupations and the environment. So we're asking students to really consider what the evidence is in terms of what's the relationship between the person and their health and what they're doing and their well-being. And also looking at justifying the role of occupational therapy for enabling productive occupation. So we're asking students to perhaps read more widely than just occupational therapy literature in saying, well, what is the evidence that links people engaging in meaningful productive occupation? What is the evidence that links that with them living a healthier and more satisfying life? So I also think it's important that this course considers what the graduate attributes and professional competencies are. So at the end of our course, our students will be engaging or they will be working as professional occupational therapists. So there's standards and competencies that are required of them by the profession. So one of these, which is also reflected in the graduate attributes of the University of Newcastle, is that students are able to recognise the importance of collaboration and being responsible and productive, a productive team member. So we want them to develop skills in communicating, to develop skills in listening to other people and responding, to be able to form opinions based on the evidence and perhaps resolving conflict. Now, one way I've embedded that into the course, and I'd like to just quickly refer to the lecture that I give students in the first week of the course, which was just last week, and I asked them this question. They brainstorm what is work and what is productivity. So even before we start to define those terms, I get students to brainstorm those and get them to start to think about the influence that that has on people's health and well-being. So some of the issues I want them to consider are, what are the socio-economic issues related to work and productivity? What are some of the issues in terms of inclusion or the barriers that people face to employment if they have a disability? So students form into groups, small groups within the lecture. They discuss these issues and then they feed back to the class. Another question that I pose is whether it's reasonable that people of working age, including those with long-term health conditions or disabilities, should have the opportunity to participate in society through some form of paid employment. So I really get them to question that notion themselves and to think that through. Do they think that that's important, and why? And often their response to this is based on the legislation, anti-discrimination legislation, and also the Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities, the United Nations Convention, that says yes, it is important and it is a right for people to have the opportunity to engage in paid employment. Another way that I really get students to start to think about their own ideas and whether they're based on evidence or truth is getting them to I ask them questions about issues relating to people who have disabilities and employment. So for example, do employers with a disability have increased or employees with a disability have increased absentee rates? Yes or no? The facts are that employees with a disability actually have fewer scheduled absences. And so what's another question I ask them is, does employing a person with a disability cost more than a person without a disability? The answer to that is people with disabilities do often require modifications to their workplace, for example ramps or accessible toilets, but there is financial assistance available. So I guess we're trying to put the perspectives of someone with a disability in a broader context, so students are able to understand not just the disability and the functional implications of disability, but also look at the wider implication in terms of work and people's attitudes, employee attitudes, and perhaps environmental barriers as well. So that's an example of embedding professional competencies into the course. How have I tried to align the assessment or the assessments with the intended learning outcomes? Well, an example is the workplace or the worksite assessment report. Now that directly relates to the learning that students engage in the first 8 weeks of the course, and particularly the first, second and the sixth competency. So understanding how OTs work within the field of productivity and the relationship between the worker, the occupation and their environment, and then being able to communicate within a written format. So in terms of introducing students, I'll just go back to that, to this assessment, there is, I guess we've tried to give students autonomy in allowing them to sort of take the initiative and encourage them to dialogue with their peers, and also to be able to make use of primary sources. So what I mean is, in the workplace assessment report is an assessment they do that's a culmination of their learning in module 1, and I've embedded that into week 6. So if I go into week 6, there's a lot of information embedded into the week 6 on how they would conduct their workplace assessment, a consent letter they need to sign, a checklist they can use when they go out to the workplace, and also their rubric, the marking rubric that we will be using. So for example, in week 2 they could go into having a look at their assessment, and the first document here just explains what a workplace assessment is. So if you can see this, I've put together a form, and it's just general information about a workplace assessment. What is it? What to include in their report, how the types of assessments they could use, how they would put together a summary of their findings, and how you would analyse the job and the recommendations that you might make. Now another document that I've uploaded is an overview. So in this document there's instructions on what the students need to do when they to find an appropriate workplace and to identify a worker and a job that they do, and to complete the workplace assessment itself. They can take a checklist with them, which is here, and they can complete this checklist. They could use another assessment form if they find others that are more appropriate, but this is an example of one that they could use. So they look at the job and the tasks that are involved, the particular objects in the workplace, the organisation of the workplace, the work postures, and a whole range of other things. So again, that's another example of a form that they could use. Now, going back to here, so that's how I've tried to align the assessment with the learning outcomes of the course being practical, the students being able to access resources that relate to them being able to conduct assessments of their own accord, as well as building on their skills over the course of successive weeks, so that they learn how to conduct an assessment of the workplace, an assessment of the person, how they implement an intervention strategy where they look at what are the risks associated with particular work sites, and what they need to look at in terms of recommendations. So that's an alignment with those learning outcomes. Another important element, I believe, in being able to teach effectively in a blended learning context is making sure that the content of what you're teaching is relevant and it's interesting. So what I've tried to do is integrate online learning, but also there's retained face-to-face contact. So in looking at content, there was an acknowledgement that just embedding content or good content in the course doesn't necessarily lead to the students engaging with that content. So there was also a need to structure the learning environment in a way that students would engage with it. So one of the ways of doing that is for the students to develop communities, so learning communities, and so that they could network together and share their knowledge. Now, in having said that, there was students just have been the way the course is structured is that students attend the lectures and they attend lab groups, and they're divided into smaller groups within their labs. So about 20 students attend each lab group, and then within those groups students are divided again into smaller groups where they can discuss and feed back to each other. The other way, let's go to the Blackboard site, is that students can use the discussion board. So they use this, and there's discussion boards set up for each module, but the students can post questions, they can raise issues, or they can add resources into the discussion board, and hopefully that's an opportunity for them to really consolidate their learning, and also to clarify and build on their learning as well. In terms of learning activities, I really wanted to embed learning activities that were collaborative, that really developed students' higher order cognitive learning, and that presented diverse perspectives of working within the field of productivity. I really wanted students to challenge their learning and to discuss ideas from the readings and the lectures and the labs with their peers and the staff, and I wanted the resources to be quality resources, and for there to be expertise within the course to promote authentic learning. So one of the ways we've done that is to ask experts within the field to come and deliver some of the lectures, and also to be tutors in the labs. So there's opportunities for the students to ask questions about those therapists' experiences of working in the field of productivity. So in terms of the types of resources, again, that's been embedded into the course. An example of this would be in the lab session in week 2. We've asked students to read an article, and it's an article about a person who was injured on the ice. Prior to that, they were working in a fairly high level position as a lawyer. So this author explores the notions of work as paid employment, and how as a society there's certain expectations and social benefits of being in paid employment, and it also gives you an identity. And then moving then into a disability role where she wasn't able to was no longer able to work in her previous job, and the changes for her in terms of her sense of self and her place in society. So this particular article also looks at an occupational therapy framework or a paradigm. So it doesn't just look at focusing on the person's function, but it also looks at what does it mean in terms of their psychosocial well-being. So in terms of how the person is identifies now, if they're no longer identifying themselves as a worker or someone who has a particular job, what are their social outlets now if they're no longer based around their work environment. So this article addresses lots of those issues, and one of the resources that I've put together is asking the students to think about those issues, and then in a lab group getting them to discuss the barriers that are faced by people with disability to either moving into employment or staying in employment, and what are some of the occupational issues faced by people. So for example, they could be issues that are environmental barriers to employment. They could be attitudinal barriers to employment, so the attitudes of prospective employers, or they could just be the issues relating to whether the person has the capacity to do the job. So there's strategies to get students thinking about the conceptual issues within occupational therapy, some of the broader issues that face people with disability, and also then framing it in an occupational therapy context. So along with that, then I've put together some case studies. There are actually case studies of people who that an occupational therapist might be working with. So for example, Gordon, who's works as an estimator, he has multiple sclerosis, which has been deteriorating over time. He's got an employer who's sympathetic, but they've identified some risks for Gordon staying in his job. So, for example, he's struggling to manage stairs. He has difficulty with temperature changes within the building, and that he's fallen out of his chair a couple of times. So, so getting students to discuss in groups what are the occupational issues, what are the barriers to employment, and to generate ideas that would enhance inclusion and participation for Gordon. So the last thing that I think is a really important element to engaging students in learning in a blended learning environment is ensuring that you've got a good Blackboard site, so that the course management system is easy for them to access and it's accessible. So if I just look at that now, the way I've set it up, it's quite easy for the students to navigate around. So they first of all, when they open up the site, they go into an announcements page. There's a list of staff contacts. The getting started site is really a visual as well as an auditory orientation for them to the course, and then there's an outline of the course, and then in each module there's a lot of information about what the module contains, the assessments, when they're due, and resources that they might need to use when completing the assignment or when completing other tasks such as readings that they might need when that they'll be examined on in a multiple choice exam at the end of the semester. Also, I've tried to embed some sort of videos and images into and to be used as resources into the website, into the Blackboard site as learning tools. So for example, in week 1 I came across some really good short videos that have been put together by I think they've been put together by the Disability Rights Commissioner in the UK, and these videos portray a society where a non-disabled person is being pitied as the minority, and the disabled people are the ones that lead full and active lives. And this video is particularly relevant to occupational productivity because it looks at an able-bodied person seeking employment. So it really focuses on barriers to employment, and it looks at issues of discrimination. So really well-produced videos for students. And I think that's all. I've included a list of references that I've used in putting this information together as well. So I hope that demonstrates how I've thought about using different elements of online learning and how I could put those together, and have developed those in creating the course and hopefully engaging students. Thanks, Alan.